Ukraine is a religious country. 7 out of 10 adults will answer yes to the question, do you believe in God? 2/3 of those who believe in God are Orthodox, and generally tend to be older people. The number of religious people is growing, which distinguishes Ukraine from the rest of Europe, and from Russia. Every year at Easter, the biggest religious holiday, nearly 7 million Ukrainians come to church. 2 million people more than throughout Russia. But the Orthodoxy in Ukraine is divided. Implacable groups have coexisted over the past quarter century. The events of the past year could change everything. Orthodox people have a chance to either unite or to reinforce their differences. This is the Fener district in Istanbul, Turkey, the residence of the Patriarch of Constantinople, the day before Orthodox Christmas. Patriarch Bartholomew presents the head of the newly formed Ukrainian Orthodox Church with a certificate of autocephaly. For Patriarch Bartholomew, this is a difficult decision, one that bears the prospect of a long, difficult feud with the Russian Church. For the young, 40-year-old new Metropolitan Epiphanius of Kiev, this is an unexpected career pinnacle. For Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko, it's the end of a multi-month church campaign, which became perhaps the central part of his re-election campaign for a second presidential term. In the Church of Patriarch Bartholomew, there are many Ukrainian politicians, television workers and tourists. We all became witness to a big event, the meaning of which will be revealed only in time. Nearly 1,500 kilometers north of Istanbul, in Ukraine's Rivne region, stands the village of Ticha. There is only one church in the village, the Holy Dominion Church. Because of a feud, the church is closed. Services are held where possible. Parishioners of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate pray in the priest's garage. The walls are adorned with sacred vestments and icons. Behind a piece of cloth is an altar. The split of the local parish happened 4 years ago, after the Euromaidan revolution. Part of the parish decided to go to the Kiev Patriarchate, but the only church was privatized by the local priest of the Moscow Patriarchate. Disputes, litigation, and scandals followed. And as a result of a court decision, the church was sealed off. The procession stops at the locked doors.
Everybody shouts, Moscow, Moscow, Moscow. What does Moscow have to do with it? What relation to Moscow do we have? I have served here for 45 years. Well, back then, it was the Moscow Church. What can you do? Ukraine became free. Our church became Ukrainian. There won't be any unification here, because they are the kind of people that... They cut off the church, and what did they start saying about me? He's so-and-so, he did this and that. They smeared the gates with manure. At least they have no right to come into the house because I own this house. At least they have no right to come into the house because I own this house. So they say that I privatized the church. The state privatized the church and gave it to the community. And all the documents are there. That's why the court cases are dragging on.
Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй. Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй. Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй.
On the day when we arrived in Ticha, the Orthodox Church was paying its respects to the deceased. The Requiem service was also held within the Kiev Patriarchate community. It gathers on the outside of the closed church, in the former parish house. According to custom, on the day of remembrance of the departed, people bring loaves of bread to the temple, one for each deceased person.
We are in the same village. We are the same people. Our children go to the same school, but sometimes the husband comes here and the wife goes there. We tried approaching them and asking about taking turns in conducting the service, but they don't even want to talk to us because we are schismatics. And now the ecumenical patriarch has recognized the church, right? He's recognized it. Anyway, now no one will be taking turns in conducting the service with them. Now they are this schismatic.
The same traditions, the same church chants, the same liturgical clothes. Between this house and the garage, the divide is in their heads.
I'm still hoping they will see reason that the Father Superior of the Moscow Patriarchate community, together with the community itself, if they want goodness, peace, tranquility and unity, that they will unite with the local Orthodox Church and then they'll be one. Then I think the Ptitcha community will unite, and together we will open a temple.
На лоні Авраама, Ісака, Якова, упокоя нас, помилуй і спасе, бо він благий і чоловіколюбний.
I have faith. We thought that the Soviet Union couldn't fall apart. But has it collapsed? It has collapsed. We thought there would be no independent Ukraine, but there is. We were waiting for a local church. We see that it exists too. That's why I trust this will happen too. Time needs to pass. You know, we are people.
The division of the Ptitcha village runs beyond the church walls. There are two shops in the village. One is a general store akin to those found in Soviet times. The other is called the Shop of Patriots. Parishioners of the Moscow Patriarchate don't come here.
Добрий день кажемо. А є такі, що не відказують добрий день.
Вони взагалі не кажуть.
Зареєстрували свою громаду в 2015 році. А до цього року у нас була ж одна громада. І всі люди ходили в одну церкву.
The head of the Kiev Patriarchate parish, now the new church, has been heading the community for 4 years, since the start of the disputes over the church. He himself is a former parishioner of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Now he sees no reason to remain in unity with Moscow.
We had an agreement with the priest. If they had one vote more, then they would serve in the church. At first they kept their word, but then their hierarchs, priests, monks arrived. They took their word back, as always. The Orthodox, they are all Orthodox. There are the Canonical Moscow and Kiev Patriarchate. Both are canonical. So we don't force anyone to transfer or to stay. If you want to be part of the Russian Orthodox Church, please be part of the Russian Orthodox Church. Serve the Lord where you want to, even in the church house that we built. If that's what they want, they're welcome to do that.
Parishioners of the Moscow Patriarchate continue the procession walk around the closed temple and pray in the garage. The news from Istanbul and the creation of a new local church have not yet brought reconciliation to Ptitcha. The church in the territory of present-day Ukraine hasn't always been divided. Christianity came here later than it did to many Eastern and European people, but it came united, before the great split into Catholics and Orthodox. No one could have imagined at the dawn of the Kievan Rus Church history that the Orthodox Church itself would split, and so radically, and then it would happen in Kiev.
Здесь, на этом месте, где Почайна впадает в Днепр, 1000 лет тому назад при святом равноапостольном князе Владимире произошло крещение киевлян, которое вошло в историю как крещение Руси.
When in Ukraine, like in many other now Orthodox countries, paganism flourished, Constantinople already had a powerful church, where the definition and interpretation of the Christian faith were formulated that remain relevant for millions of Christians around the world today. Diplomats, monks and merchants set off on a mission from this harbour.
і йшли на місію дипломати, монахи і торговці.
The end of the 10th century saw the rise of the empire. It survived hard times in the 8th century. It was in crisis during the first half of the 9th century, and then it began to emerge from the crisis. It began to push the Arabs to the east, and at the end of the 10th century, it was rising on an incredible level, and this lasted 70 to 80 years. It was only after that the decline began, and continued practically uninterrupted. But at that time, somehow everyone in Europe felt that there was strength in Constantinople. Strength, luxury, wealth are always attractive.
With all the potential that the Roman Empire had, since the Byzantine Empire did not exist, there was the Roman Empire, just the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Their identity was completely Roman. They called themselves Romans. We are Romans, only Greek-speaking Romans, not Syriac-speaking Romans. With all the potential they had, economic, cultural, intellectual, they practically used none of it for missionary purposes.
For the Byzantines, only those territories that had ever belonged to the Roman Empire had meaning and significance. North of the Danube and more or less of Crimea and the Caucasus Mountains, they generally weren't very interested in these lands. The Byzantines didn't have the idea of globally expanding their empire, like Rome did. They had this concept of a border, and in the Balkans, they spared no power to reach the old borders, to reach the Danube. In the end, they did it. And in the north, what was there to catch?
The Rus of that time, Rus in the hierarchy of a Byzantine emperor in the mid-10th century, these were northern barbarians. This was a direct threat to Constantinople. Accordingly, the strategic task of any decent emperor would have been to work out the right policy to keep these barbarians on terms favorable for the empire.
Byzantium entered into a union with Kiev under Emperor Basil II. He ruled the empire for almost half a century. During this time, the borders of Byzantium expanded significantly. Under Basil, an event occurred that is now known as the Baptism of Rus. The emperor led many wars with neighbors. In Istanbul, the remains of the emperor's former triumph, the ruins of the Golden Gates of Constantinople, have been preserved. It was through these gates that Basil would enter the city after military campaigns.
He earned the terrible nickname of Bulgar Slayer. Near the end, it got to the point where he blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, leaving one person with one eye for every 100 blind people, and let them go to Bulgaria. He was a man of unspeakable violence, but also of unspeakable willpower. He really did change the course of history. You can say that he did a disservice to Byzantium. He brought the imperial bureaucratic centralization of the empire to the point of absurdity, and temporarily it had a great effect. He left a full treasury before he died and restored the territorial integrity of Byzantium from the Danube to the Euphrates. However, if you look strategically, his victories were very short-lived. After some 15-20 years, the irreversible decline of Byzantium began. The currency collapsed, and for no apparent reason, so bureaucratic centralization has its limits.
During one of the countless campaigns, Emperor Basil II turned to a northern barbarian called Vladimir for military help. In gratitude, he promised his sister Anna's hand in marriage to the prince.
The emperor did not keep his word. Enraged, Volodymyr the Barbarian took the city of Korsun by storm, and after that, Constantinople had to make concessions, giving him the sister of the ruling emperor as his wife.
He really did pay with his sister. But was he really interested in business on the far northern periphery? I doubt it. I don't think so. In a funny way, during the middle of the 11th century, our most important Byzantine historian, Michael Psalius, when he describes Kievan Rus' last invasion of the Constantinople, the naval one, he says that the barbarians had left their fear behind because Basil kept them under control. He was a threat to them, and after his death they forgot their fear, not a word about Christianization, not a word about Anna, not a word about the fact that they were brothers by faith. They are barbarians who fear only whips. And this whip for them was the very same Emperor Basil. This is how the Byzantines saw it. So that's how it was. And there's no denying that the baptismal name of Prince Volodymyr is Basil, in honor of his high-born relative.
A city in the Kiev region was named Vasilyev, in honor of the cruel emperor. Today, it's called Vasilkiv. According to one version, it was here, in the residence of Vladimir, and not in Chersonesus or Kiev, that the baptism of the Kievan Rus took place. After a century following the baptism, Nestor the chronicler didn't know its exact place. Only one thing was known. After the prince, his family, court and army adopted Christianity, Kiev and Byzantium began to cooperate politically.
At one time, they wrote that the Greeks engaged in espionage, sent reports about what was happening here to Constantinople, and implemented some kind of policy for Constantinople. There were also other accounts where the Greeks were actually idle. But who in Kiev could have known the Greek language?
They, of course, were not trusted because of a monumental cultural dissonance. After all, these are very different cultures. Byzantine culture is complex, verbose, indirect. There is a tradition to speak colorfully and in a roundabout way. For the ordinary Slavs, this was unfamiliar and, more importantly, suspicious. The famous phrase from the Chronicle, "The Greeks are big flatterers, even to this day," was written at the turn of the 11th and 12th centuries, when the Greeks seemed to have become brothers. But as you can see, they are to this day, that is, to the times of Nestor, they are flatterers. That is, they are evil, ambiguous, and so on. And in the future, that attitude remained exactly the same.
A living monument of Byzantine culture is Kiev Sophia Cathedral. Built before the Great Schism, 5 centuries after Constantinople's, its exterior didn't preserve the form customary for temples of that time, but inside much of that has remained. Arches, frescoes, mosaics. It's so similar that Kiev Sophia is often touchingly called a smaller copy of Constantinople's Sophia.
They received everything ready to go and in perfect form. They could not even appreciate how beautiful and perfect that is. Moreover, they could not reproduce it for a long time. It took a long time before they learned how to reproduce and maybe even improve these samples. In Kiev, it just stopped because of the Mongol invasion. This led, strictly speaking, to the ritual of faith. This superficial attitude towards Christianity at its early stage.
The situation changed only when it turned out that the Rus were getting richer and Byzantium was becoming poor. If at first the Greeks did not want to go to Kiev, it was terrible and disgusting for them, then as the Turkish danger grew, this prospect ceased to be so terrible. So the money was there in the north, and Byzantium could not do anything. It was tangled up in debts. It was entirely dependent on the Latin merchants, bankers, and so on. As this went on, respect for the Rus grew, and the Byzantines more and more often began to talk about the Holy Rus. It was the Byzantines who invented the phrase Holy Rus in the 14th century for the purpose of flattery, so to speak.
Few centuries after Christianity came to Kiev, the Rus experienced a serious historical shock, the invasion of Batu Khan. It changed the course of Kiev's Christianization. The devastation, the killing of monks, the destruction of churches, hindered the development of the church.
In the 14th to 15th centuries, the former Rus, these were basically several new geopolitical entities, the Kingdom of Poland, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Tver and Moscow principalities, which actually emerged from the ruins of a Rus, start to argue over who should own the church heritage. Since the end of the 13th century, the Metropolitan of Kiev has had his own residence on the territory of the Moscow Principality. First, it was in Vladimir on Klязьма, and later in Moscow.
Peter, the first Metropolitan of Kiev, was born in Berlin and later settled in Moscow. He was appointed to Kiev by Constantinople, but moved there under pressure from the prince. In Moscow, the Metropolitan founded the High Monastery of St. Peter, which has been preserved. This is where the Kiev Metropolitan was buried. The relocation of the hierarch did not go unnoticed.
However, the Lithuanian Prince Algirdas, who already controlled the greater part of the Rus, and this is the present territory of Ukraine and Belarus, begins to demand that Constantinople ordain a separate Metropolitan of Kiev that would not depend on the rival Moscow prince, and thus begins the first split and divide of a single metropolis and separation from the Greeks as such. If we talk about the two sisters of the Kiev metropolis, first of all I would point out that the Kiev metropolis had internal freedom from the state. The dynamism and flexibility of this Kiev tradition is due to the fact that it came in different contexts. Meanwhile, in Moscow, due to the extremely close connection between the church and the state, and the hierarchization and sacralization of power, the church evolved differently, and we still see the difference between these two metropolises. On the one hand, we see how the Russian church turned out to be connected with the Kremlin, and we see how the Ukrainian church turns out to be quite flexible, even in transition to a new jurisdiction.
While Moscow and Kiev were starting a protracted dispute over who was superior, the Patriarchate of Constantinople decided to unite with Rome to form one church. In 1439, the Ferrara-Florence Union was signed in Florence. The union of the churches was short-lived and led to serious canonical consequences for Ukraine.
In Moscow, they look at Constantinople as a church that has fallen into sin, wound up under the Turks, and has no authority over them. In Kiev, they claim that Constantinople is our historical mother church, and because of this, we are separated. We are special because we still maintain contact with Constantinople. And the Metropolitan of Kiev, Petro-Mohila, is the exarch of the Patriarch of Constantinople, so therefore, we follow authentic church tradition more than anyone else. If it weren't for Petro-Mohila, we would not be talking about the autocephalous church today. Why? He is a church leader, even non-Ukrainian ethnically, Moldovan or Romanian, created this powerful school, this theological tradition. At that time, he made it the strongest Orthodox church in Eastern Europe. The Kiev metropolis, subordinate to the Constantinople Patriarchate.
At this time, the metropolis was divided among several state entities. Some were ruled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, some by the hetmanate of the right bank, and others by hetmanate of the left bank. Left bank hetmans at that time were subordinate to the Moscow state. That is, the Kiev metropolis experienced a political fragmentation that forced the Orthodox population. And above all, of course, church hierarchs to be politicians too.
By this time, Moscow definitively stepped out of Constantinople's control. After signing the union, the Moscow Church declared itself autocephalous, and after 100 years, through schemes and bribes, acquired a letter of approval for the Moscow Patriarchate. In a little less than 100 years, Moscow will take Kiev for itself.
When submission became inevitable in the 1680s, in Kiev, they tried to bargain for the Kiev metropolis to retain a special status in this ecclesiastical system of the Moscow Patriarchate.
The conditions under which Kiev became submissive to the Moscow Church were written by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Dionysius. His requirements were simple. He gave Kiev metropolis to the administration temporarily, with an obligation to consider the ecumenical patriarch to be the main one in Kiev. The Patriarch's original letter to Moscow has been lost. The only verified copy was found by Russian historian Vera Chentsova. Her discovery was the main documentary evidence of Kiev's independence from Moscow.
Is it not an embarrassment that a Muscovite found this letter in Greek? I am very grateful to her for this publication, her work and so on. It's all wonderful, but for Fanar, this is an embarrassment.
This is quite a complicated theological canonical text that a simple interpreter from the ambassadorial order may not have been able to translate correctly, because the interpreters of the ambassadorial order are not always theologically educated people. Although I think that the Moscow Patriarch and his entourage perfectly understood, in essence, both the transfer of the right to blessing and judgment, and that the Patriarch of Constantinople should be commemorated first. I think it was pretty obvious to them who was commemorated first and why.
Difficulties of interpretation still persist. Moscow believes that 300 years ago, Constantinople transferred Kiev to them forever. Therefore, they don't recognize the current decision of Patriarch Bartholomew.
The letter doesn't indicate that this is forever. Indeed, Moscow documents and the internal discussion in Moscow insist that this is forever. And in reality, that's not in there.
Yes, Moscow didn't fulfill some of the points that were in Dionysius' guarantee. I'm going to be speaking from Moscow's point of view, sorry. But the thing is, there is no agreement of a Kiev transfer to Moscow. On the other hand, this means that in principle, the Patriarchate can easily say, this is mine, and I will put it wherever I want. We cancel the gift, and that's it, which is what he actually did. But on the other hand, to accuse Moscow of being obligated, excuse me, it doesn't matter what you wrote about our obligations in Istanbul. We did not sign this.
You've also used this word, that the Moscow Church annexed the metropolis, seized it. We somehow denote this in very aggressive terms. The Russian Orthodox Church at that time also happens to be subordinate and a captive. It is already completely part of the state apparatus, this emerging Russian Empire.
The Russian Church definitively became part of the state under Peter the Great. He abolished the Patriarchate, which wasn't easily acquired by Moscow. 300 years after Peter, the Church is headed by the officials of the Synod, the actual ministry of religious affairs of the Russian Empire. The Ukrainian Church was also subordinate to the Synod, up until the 1917 revolution.
The fall of the Russian Empire, the revolution, and all these bloody events lead to upsurge. A Moscow Patriarch appears again from nothing. We have masses of autocephalous movements. A new stage had begun. Before 1917, we had no Moscow Patriarchs.
At the time of the revolution, this was the time of the Hetmanate and the Directory, the Ukrainian People's Republic, the whole movement for the independence of Ukraine, and for the independence and autocephaly of their church began. We remember the people active in church matters, Professor Ivan Ohienko, later Archmetropolitan Ilarion, who translated the good book from the original Hebrew and Greek languages into modern Ukrainian, Professor Alexander Lototsky, who travelled here to Constantinople to ask for autocephaly for the Ukrainian Church. Obviously, at the time of war, when power changed hands in Kiev every few days, Ukrainian People's Republic could not stand it. It was impossible to resolve this issue in Ukraine then. Soviets and various movements came, and both in Ukraine and in Russia, they liquidated churches.
Concessions came in 1988, on the 1000th anniversary of the baptism of Rus. In the midst of perestroika, this significant date was widely celebrated in Kiev. The revival of the church and its independence had begun. But complete church independence was still far away.
It was not the right time to obtain autocephaly. There was still the Soviet order. Maybe not a lot has changed even by now. The church in Ukraine must cleanse itself. There are many problems, they're everywhere. But at that time, the country was not politically ready for this.
When religious freedom finally came, churches began to develop rapidly in Ukraine. There were different jurisdictions, scandals, visits from bishops. The one to come through this religious storm of the early 1990s was the former exarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, Filaret. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, he became one of the main supporters of the idea of Ukraine's church independence. In 1995, Filaret was elected Patriarch of the self-proclaimed Kiev Patriarchate. Moscow and its patriarch spent the entire first half of the 90s reacting with menacing statements in response to the events unfolding in Ukraine. Fighting between the churches began anew in 2004. After the Orange Revolution and the election of Viktor Yushchenko and his team, it became clear that Ukraine would be defending its independence from Moscow, including its church independence.
The circumstances then were slightly different, of course, both political and church circumstances. First, in terms of political circumstances, there was no war, which was the most important thing that led Constantinople, the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian churches to take this very sharp and decisive step. Secondly, the position of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church itself was different then. At that time, it was headed by the Metropolitan Volodymyr, who was very open to dialogue with other churches in Ukraine.
Metropolitan Vladimir Sabadan led the Ukrainian Orthodox Church after Filaret left the church and created the Kiev Patriarchate. The coming years under Vladimir would be a time of development and relative independence for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate.
He was a living person, not dogmatic, not hardened, a man with an open view of the world and with common sense. I think he was personally sympathetic to this idea that the church could be more independent. As a person who was educated in Moscow, he of course understood that he needed to act very carefully, but to act nonetheless. Of course, he had a personal evolution from a very pro-Moscow activist coming to Kiev in 1992 to a very pro-Kiev activist in 2008.
The policy of the Moscow Patriarchate during Sabadan's time was like that of a carrot on a stick. They held the carrot. The traditional answer was this: we do not have anything against Ukrainian autocephaly, but there should be a local council, not an episcopal one, and don't hurry me. A favorable time will come. What did they mean by favorable time? It's difficult to say. Maybe when there will be some kind of consensus within the whole Ukraine or something, it's not clear. A certain time will come, and of course we will give this. And how long will this take? 10 years, 2 years, 5 generations? No one specified.
If this was God's will, I'm sure that the church life would have gone in a completely different direction than the one it followed after all those previous years. We met with the Ecumenical Patriarch. I think we had 4 or 5 meetings. But the purpose of a first meeting was to establish in what stature the Ecumenical Patriarch and the Synod of Constantinople would view the Ukrainian church territory.
Metropolitan Kirill flew to Kiev as part of Patriarch Alexei's delegation. In honor of the anniversary of the baptism of Rus, they organized a large-scale concert on Maidan.
Мы признаем здесь юрисдикцию, единственную юрисдикцию, это юрисдикцию Патриархии Московской.
Those who were pro-autocephaly in Ukraine were satisfied with this small advancement. We'll add a little bit there, say something here, or made something again, and so on. The trajectory was quite visible. It was evident. By and large, this changed with the arrival of the new patriarch, and then the new metropolitan in Kiev. This carrot was taken away. It was indecent to even speak of it, but on the contrary, this idea of the Russian world appeared with completely incomprehensible borders. The concept of the Soviet Union as the whole world with incomprehensible borders.
If we're speaking about Moscow's position at that time, it was the same as now. This rejection of the possibility of creating a local church in Ukraine. But at that time, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was trying to play the role of a mediator, if you will, between Moscow and Constantinople, without explicitly taking Moscow's side.
After 1.5 years of colossal debate, I convinced the ecumenical patriarch that he needed to make an official visit to Ukraine.
I remember Patriarch Bartholomew's statement, what he said then on Sophia Square. He even used the word annexation in relation to the Ukrainian metropolis, when the then Kiev Metropolitan Church was transferred to the Moscow administration. There is a certain consistency in messages in the narratives that are formed, formulated and passed on to the Constantinople Patriarchate.
According to the holy canons of the Orthodox Church and our tradition, it is our duty and our right to guarantee and to express in the inter-Orthodox unity.
Попала ситуація, яка не планувалася. А не планувалася ситуація візиту московського патріарха.
An unplanned situation would arise during the projected visit. That situation was the visit of the Moscow Patriarch. All the church representatives who visited Ukraine at that time came at the invitation of the President of Ukraine. I did not, however, send an invitation to Russian Patriarch Alexei II.
Yes, quite right. Patriarch Alexei was in Kiev, although of course he did not want to come. He came despite himself. His health even deteriorated while he was in Kiev.
And within the framework of that unintended visit, one small shift would occur in the program. It was that Patriarch Alexei II had invited the ecumenical patriarch to dinner. I officially warned Patriarch Bartholomew, who I love very much. I'm not taking any responsibility for what may happen to you at that dinner. Take a look at my face. I've gotten a taste of those pleasantries.
Metropolitan Kirill flew to Kiev as part of Patriarch Alexei's delegation. In honor of the anniversary of the baptism of Rus, they organized a large-scale concert on Maidan.
С большой гордостью и уважением хочу представить вам митрополита Кирилла, который прилетел из Москвы поздравить Киев с крещением Руси.
Привет, Киев, привет, Украина! Замечательный святой Лаврентий Черниговский, не я, сказал вот какие прекрасные слова. Россия, Украина, Беларусь – это и есть святая Русь. Россия, Украина, Беларусь – это и есть святая Русь.
I, of course, didn't like this, specifically this part of his speech, because it had an element of manipulation and imposition. People did not come to this. Shevchuk is not at all the voice of the Kremlin in Moscow and not a proponent of the Russian world. This is an attempt to impose something on people who came for something different and sort of associate them with this message.
Господь для нас — это любовь, а любовь — это то право, которого мы все достойны. Дай Бог вам любви, ребята. Дай Бог любви.
We would first agree on the procedural part. The procedural part, as it looked in the final version, proceeded from the fact that every leader, that is including those of the Autocephalous Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate, would write a petition addressing the Patriarch of Constantinople, asking for support and expressing our desire to create a single Ukrainian church.
They reached the point where the Constantinople Patriarchate could recognize this independent church with the Kiev Patriarchate forming the basis, but without Patriarch Filaret as the head of this church. As a matter of fact, even now Patriarch Filaret was forced not to stand as a candidate for head of the church. This remained the condition of Constantinople. This time it was fulfilled. We see that all the requirements Constantinople set out in 2008 remained. Autocephaly was almost proclaimed. This was not autocephaly, it was the restoration of the Kiev metropolis under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. We asked, when will we receive autocephaly? No one could answer this question. Looking at it today, did he do the right thing by not accepting it, or did he make a mistake? That's the question. History will reveal the answer.
Patriarch Filaret is a clergyman with a unique destiny. He has served in different jurisdictions in Kiev for more than half a century. Regimes, state leaders, and parties have changed, but Filaret still remains the oldest bishop of Ukraine's Orthodox Church, by age, experience, public and private authority. The process of granting autocephaly coincided with Filaret's birthday. He turned 90. On his birthday, we came to the service at St. Vladimir's Cathedral, a place where he has held thousands of worship services.
Це були роки холодної війни. Як силу, яка примирювала сторони, підключили Всесвітню Раду церков. Вона зовнішньо займалась єдністю всіх християн, а фактично Всесвітня Рада церков була другою організацією Об'єднаних Націй. І я був туди рекомендований митрополитом Нікодимом. Митрополит Нікодим і переконав КГБ, владу радянську, що треба ставити молодих архієреїв. Тоді ми можемо працювати в цій Всесвітній Раді церков.
Patriarch Filaret became established as a church leader of the highest rank in the late 60s. It was when the church was headed by Patriarch Pimen and the country by Leonid Brezhnev, and the Russian Orthodox Church was completely dependent on the authorities and under the control of the KGB.
Українського екзархата привітати всіх вас і ваші особи, всіх членів Товариства Україна з 10-річчям його існування. Я бажаю, щоб робота нашого товариства і далі все зміцнювалась і приносила більше користі нашій радянській Україні і нашому радянському Союзі.
With the consent of the party and the church, Filaret was assigned external affairs. He often travelled abroad, met foreign delegations, and did not criticize the Soviet authorities.
Of course, this was a metropolitan from our church. He was ours. But it turns out that he was not really on our side, because he renounced the church in which he had been baptized, in which he was ordained, in which he had accepted the monkhood.
In the 90s, Filaret was energetically building a new church, creating and winning space for the Kiev Patriarchate, independent from Moscow. In the 26 years of its existence, the self-proclaimed Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate had not been recognized by anyone in the Orthodox world. Constantinople declared all the prohibitions and punishments Moscow imposed on Filaret on October 11, 2018, as invalid. He was reinstated as a bishop. By the decision of Patriarch Bartholomew, Filaret again became canonical, legal.
I want to remind you why they had imposed a church ban on Filaret. It wasn't because he perpetrated the church schism, but because he was literally the persecutor of a church. The fact that today someone says these prohibitions have been lifted from him, does this mean that such behavior is now canonized and presented as an example for all other local churches?
Filaret held a first service following Istanbul's decision in Ternopil. There, he remained the head of the Kiev Patriarchate. In a few months, his closest disciple and assistant, Epiphanius, will become head of the new church, which is impossible to imagine without Filaret. The Maidan radically changed Ukraine's church history. Prayers were held all throughout the Revolution of Dignity, on stage, in tents, on the square, on the barricades. Icons, crosses and rosaries became an inherent part of the protests.
Помагай мені з Пресвятою Владичицею нашою Богородицею, з усіма небесними силами, завжди нині повсякчас і на віки віків. Амінь.
When we realized that the events of 2013-14 had begun, when war broke out in eastern Ukraine, and Patriarch Kirill, for example, began to propagandize a thesis about holy war in those first months, it became abundantly clear that amongst the ideological principles of a conflict, religion would quickly become a cornerstone issue.
War came after Maidan. The annexation of Crimea and fighting in the Donbass changed the country's attitude towards Russia. For Ukrainians, it became an aggressor country.
Strictly speaking, courtesy the underlying political affairs that had occurred in the past 5 to 7 years, all of it, the matter of the war, the deterioration of relations between Moscow and Constantinople, all of it led to a profound revision of relations.
A terrible war is going on, and all this paved the way for today's situation. The time has come. There have been developments on a global scale, which today contribute to the declaration of autocephaly for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
проголошення автокефалії для Української православної церкви в Україні.
The pain of war and Ukraine's resentment towards Russia reached Constantinople. Processes that otherwise would have lasted for centuries were accelerated. Istanbul also had its own reasons for seriously considering Ukrainian church independence.
Bartholomew's old age is an important factor, yes. He wants to go down in history, to do something to appear before God, as they say. And here the consequences are left for others to deal with.
He is a very wise man. He has a sharp mind, and he is determined to ensure that the issues that he takes on are always resolved. He is very well informed. He knows full well what is at stake and which facts may be involved. And he's consistent enough in the fact that if a decision is made, then it surely must be implemented.
Patriarch Bartholomew has headed the Patriarchate of Constantinople since 1991. A native of Turkey and a Greek by birth, he received a brilliant education at leading church universities in Europe. His specialization is canon law. It is difficult to find someone who measures up to Bartholomew in this complex discipline within the Eastern Church.
He's certainly a talented administrator and manager of the church, and a man with vision. He knows the history of ecumenical patriarchy perfectly. He sees how this past can be realized in the future, but he relies on his predecessors. One of his brightest predecessors was Patriarch Athenagoras. In this sense, all the patriarchies adhered to, and adhere to still, to a certain line.
This line emphasizes the primacy of Constantinople for the entire Orthodox world. The seniority of the Fana is unspoken. Not everyone supports it. For example, in the Russian Church, they often accuse the Patriarchate of Constantinople of papism, an offensive way of referring to practices of the Western Church, which they use to describe the desire to centralize Orthodoxy like Rome.
The Patriarch studied in Italy, loves Italy very much, speaks Italian beautifully, loves Rome and has friendly relations with many hierarchs in the Catholic Church, including Pope Francis. Before that, he had a great relationship with Pope Benedict. These are people of a completely Western formation, of course. The principles of church management, administrative principles, they're fully borrowed from European, Western culture of management and transparency, accountability and other things.
The ecumenical patriarchs had been trying to convene a pan-Orthodox council for more than 50 years to discuss the special role of Constantinople.
Back then, the ecumenical patriarch was working on the task of convening an ecumenical Orthodox council in the early 2000s. This was his goal, and the goal of a synod, that is to hold a World Orthodox Council. The Orthodox Council ultimately did take place in 2016, but at the last moment, the Russian Orthodox Church refused to participate.
We will not be able to take part in the Pan-Orthodox Council because the Council, in this case, won't be Pan-Orthodox. Consensus can't be reached on any question. And consequently, the only decision is to move the term of the Council. We will approach the Patriarch of Constantinople with this proposition.
The Bulgarian, Georgian, Antiochian churches all refused to participate. The Moscow Church actually declared that it would not recognize the decision of the Ecumenical Council because it did not consider it ecumenical. The effect would be to have the question of Ukrainian autocephaly to be dropped from the agenda.
Two years after the unsuccessful council on Crete, when the Orthodox patriarchs quarreled over Russia's position, Patriarch Kirill flew to Istanbul. His visit was no longer connected with the affairs of the entire Orthodoxy. Kirill came to save his affairs in Ukraine.
There is a schism. It will be necessary to wait. Something could have happened. But would it have been worse than it was during and after the Cretan Council, which took place in 2016? The Orthodox forces have more or less decided on this issue.
Fanar's papism is not heresy to Orthodoxy. It is a cancer to Orthodoxy. It's lived there for centuries. This is not something that they've just invented in order to annoy Moscow. Unfortunately, it is completely understandable that Patriarch Kirill wants to replace the Fanar papism with his own. In this sense, I am not on his side. It is important to know that the rest of the Orthodox world also understands this.
The conflict between Moscow and Constantinople peaked. The result was a complete breakdown of church relations between the patriarchates. After Istanbul made it clear that they would be a Ukrainian autocephaly, Moscow broke off Eucharistic communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate.
Реагировать надо спокойно. В практическом плане это решение означает, что мы не сможем совершать совместные богослужения с Константинопольским патриархатом. Наши архиереи и священники не смогут участвовать в совершении литургии. Совместно с иерархами и священниками Константинопольского патриархата, а миряне не смогут причащаться в храмах Константинопольского патриархата.
All the problems that they are now trying to create between Moscow and Constantinople, between Moscow and Kiev, have not a church, but rather an anti-church character. I stand by the position of theological normativity. From these positions of normativity, Moscow's attitude to Ukraine, Moscow's attitude to Constantinople is not theological. It is politically driven. Indeed, the situation with Ukraine is also highly politically driven. I think it is a bad thing.
We can well see that according to various pretentious statements, the Mother Church is supposed to have been worried about everyone, that the Mother Church is absolutely abandoned by everyone, to be torn apart by all the evil elements of this world.
Today on the Ukrainian front there is a clash between two phantom empires, the Byzantine Empire and the Soviet Empire. And both sides have their own phantom pains, their own ideas about the uniqueness of their place in history.
The plan of the Ecumenical Patriarchate was simple: to invite all three Ukrainian churches to unite, and then give the new united church autocephaly. But to bring together those who have become accustomed to splitting for almost 30 years turned out to be an impossible task.
The leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church created very big obstacles for such a collaboration. Some Ukrainian oligarchs, and not only Ukrainian oligarchs, who gained unprecedented influence in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in this situation, tried very hard to do this. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church came under the influence of the oligarchs as a result of this feeling of insecurity and fear, and the hierarchs and the leadership of the Church found themselves facing uncertainty before these new challenges.
The main sponsor of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate over the past few years has been MP and businessman Vadim Novinsky. Having become a citizen of Ukraine under President Viktor Yanukovych, he remains a supporter of political, financial, and ecclesiastical unity with Moscow. Novinsky is a subdeacon. He occupies the lowest ecclesiastical rank of an assistant in worship. But not every metropolitan can compare with him in influencing the processes of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Representatives of the Holy Synod traveled to the Fanar. There they met with a Patriarch Bartholomew, the bishops of a Patriarchate of Constantinople, and very weighty arguments had been put before them. Among the members of a delegation were bishops who represented the regions which had suffered the most in Ukraine, that is, the regions of eastern Ukraine, those of the Donbass. And what would happen to the church there? What would happen to believers in this particular region? That was not taken into account. It was ignored.
In order to remind people of themselves in the midst of the celebrations for the anniversary of the baptism of Rus, the parishioners of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate organized religious processions in the major centers of their church. The biggest was held in Kiev.
Look at what happens with the procession that takes place every year. That is the opposition to our church, simply because people are walking down the road and praying. They don't seek any favors. They make no demands. They just walk and sing and pray, and this causes a crazed reaction. A crazed reaction from those who do not share the position of these people. What is this? Is this human? Why? Everything that the Moscow Patriarchate is doing now in Ukraine, these are the steps of a person trying to commit suicide, one who's getting closer and closer to the noose that he wants to stick his head through. Each next step separates the structure from society. Everything that is being done, every one of these statements, every one of these movements, every one of these actions, is in basic opposition to the society and its expectations. They are simply driving themselves into a ghetto and into a corner. Patriarch Philaret and Metropolitan Macarius had organized the process of collecting signatures in their churches, and then they passed them on. As for the UOCMP, all relevant information about the signatures had already been made public by Bartholomew. Those who had wanted to do it, well, they did it.
The hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate almost unanimously ignored the process of unification with those whom they had called schematics for decades. Despite the fact that if not a massive, then a solid number of bishops were expected to transition, out of nearly 100 hierarchs, 2 came to the new church: Metropolitan Alexander from Kiev and Simeon from Vinnytsia.
The government should not have just provided for hierarchs, priests, Ukrainian Orthodox Church laymen to make their own choice in favour of the new church, but they should have protected this choice. They were the ones who had to make that choice. But because the pressure on the hierarchs from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church leadership from Moscow was so strong, not even the government was able to ensure that they were the ones left to make this choice. This was the result of the government's weakness. The state was at fault.
Given the circumstances in which our church finds itself now, it's funny for me to hear that we threaten anyone. They themselves had been a source of enormous pressure, both on government officials and other church leaders.
The Ukrainian government played a key role in the process of acquiring autocephaly. Petro Poroshenko made the church one of the main issues of his election campaign. After receiving Tomos, the president toured the regions to show voters the letter from Constantinople on autocephaly.
It is important to carefully walk on thin ice when politicizing such issues, because more than anything else, this idea will suffer from the fact that a significant portion of politicians or society will classify this as a politically biased initiative. Something for the president to use for positive PR, or maybe get some points. You can look back at our history. As a rule, in our history, the church is created by the state.
Ukraine's case is not particularly different from the autocephalous Church of Greece, Bulgarian, Serbian and Romanian churches, but the government's involvement in Ukraine's case is much milder than state intervention in the 19th and even in the early 20th century. Moreover, there has not been a single case where the state hadn't interfered in the process of getting autocephaly. If it hadn't interfered, that would have been unprecedented.
Of course, especially when it comes to the bishops and abbots of the largest monasteries. I think that the Ukrainian special services have a lot of compromising information on all of them, financial as well as intimate and political in some cases, so they will be made offers they can't resist.
Of course, I understand that this conversation is preventative, with the aim of avoiding provocations from those who want to compromise my position as hierarch of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
The security service called servants of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate from several Ukrainian regions at once. They were called in as part of an investigation into treason and incitement of religious hatred. No charges were brought against the priests. Ukrainian authorities paid close attention to lavras. These are especially large monasteries in Orthodoxy, which church authorities give greater autonomy in management and financial affairs. 3 large monasteries form the center of Russian Orthodoxy in Ukraine. The most loyal monks, priests, and parishioners of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church visit, pray, and live here. Svetogorsk Lavra stands on the banks of the Seversky Donets River. Once the Scythians lived here. The monastery stands on a high bank on the slopes of the Chalky Mountains, where the monks carved out the caves. The monastery's been here for a long time, but it only gained status in 2004, when Donetsk politicians and businessmen became actively involved with it. The monastery's property and buildings expanded over 15 years. Now the Lavra is a town-forming monastery for Svetogorsk, a city half an hour drive from Slavyansk. When war came to Slavyansk and the city was captured by Igor Strelkov's militants, the monks at the monastery provided support to the separatists.
Back in 2014, the monks of the Svetogorsk Lavra who came to us in Slavyansk explicitly said that there is a prophecy of the elders of their Lavra that the liberation and reunification of Rus, in their understanding it's Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, will begin 6 months after the heretics, schismatics, seized the Kiev-Pechersk and Pachayev Lavras.
After Slavyansk was liberated from Strelkov's gang, monastic life went on. Now in the territory of the monastery, there is a shelter for internally displaced people from frontline regions. The Lavra feeds those in need and pilgrims daily for free. Next to the monastery stands a monument dedicated to revolutionary and terrorist Artyom. During the last century's civil war, he was engaged in punitive operations in the Donbass. His monument is a world-recognized constructivist masterpiece. There are disputes about its demolition. The Lavra itself is not in danger. This monastery is a center of pilgrimage and tourism. It primarily serves those who live in the Donbass and without reservation supports the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. In western Ukraine's Ternopil region there is another Lavra, the Pachayev Lavra. The history of these lands is a tangle of various jurisdictions, patriarchates and autocephalys. The monastery was Orthodox, then it became Catholic, and then again Orthodox over a period of 500 years. Its architecture is reminiscent of its Catholic past. Each time the transition was carried out by force, with direct participation of armies and authorities. During the Soviet rule there was a psychiatric hospital here, though the monks were not evicted.
Even Stalin and Khrushchev didn't close Pachayev. We know that those of faith suffered in the 20th century. But it's difficult to explain in a human way why they didn't close Pachayev at that moment. Not only was it not closed, but Pachayev remained a source of spiritual enlightenment even during the Soviet period.
Много веков Почаевская лавра противостояла всем варварам-завоевателям, униатам, жестокому, насильственному окатоличиванию православного населения.
These scenes show the current Patriarch Filaret visiting Pachayev. Back then he was the head of the Exarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Ukrainian SSR. At the end of the Soviet period, religious life was revived here. People started speaking about the Lavra's transition in the early 90s, when the denominational map started rapidly changing in Western Ukraine.
My understanding is that anyone who forcibly provokes the seizure of churches, property, monasteries, Lavras, is a provocateur and an agent of the Kremlin. Because Moscow wants to show to the same ecumenical patriarch that Thomas sows among Ukrainians, particularly in the Ternopil region, enmity, bloodshed and conflict.
If these monastic communities evict the current monks from their lavras, I, as an idealist, would say that this would benefit them. If you are not a real monk, if you are fooling around, then I don't really feel sorry for your adventures.
So far there has been no open conflict, but the governor of Lavra, who holds absolute power, constantly talks about possible seizures, danger, and a circle of enemies.
Such shrines as the Pachayev Lavra, Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, should belong to the state, because on the one hand, it is the spiritual heritage of the Ukrainian people, and on the other, a monument of world importance.
In Pachayev we found ourselves in the midst of the intercession of the Theotokos. This is one of the most beloved church holidays in Ukraine. Thousands of people have gathered here for prayer, not only from surrounding villages and parishes that remain in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, but also from all over Ukraine. So far all of them are distant to the idea of autocephaly, but does this make them enemies of their country? The third and main Lavra is the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. This is not only the largest monastery in Ukraine, but also the oldest. It was here, in the middle of the 11th century, that the first Byzantine monastic constitution was brought from Constantinople. Today, the Kiev Lavra is the residence and the office of the Metropolitan, head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. This is where the seminary is. The governing bodies of the church and finances are also concentrated here.
If you're just out to make a fast buck, there's another matter. What is called supervised cleaning, all at gunpoint, all sponsors and so on are heaped. But if it's not your career that interests you, but your soul, then it's better to leave these lavras, especially since these lavras, all three, are too politicized.
The Kiev-Pechersk Lavra was transferred to the church several years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Filaret received the documents from the state. In a few years he will leave the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but the Lavra will not follow him. The ancient monastery is besieged in ideological terms. The brothers consider themselves to be the advocates of the only legitimate canonical orthodoxy, Moscow's.
ныне и присно и во веки веков.
After the process of gaining autocephaly was started, Ukraine's Ministry of Culture sent employees to the monastery to inspect how the monks preserved cultural monuments. The complaints were minor, but the leadership of Lavra constantly talks about the threat.
Today, the fighters for the so-called truth want the Lavra to cease to exist altogether.
I can repeat this for the 5th time if needed. For us, the main thing is calm, peace, and the search for models of communication. If a monastery or a lavra does not want to transition, do you think that it will be stormed or forced to do so in some other way? This issue will be discussed within the monastic community, and only there.
The fate of the Kiev Lavra remains to be decided. The new church and its parishioners obviously want to obtain the main monastery, historically connected to the Byzantine. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, has no intention of letting it go.
It will be part of a canonical church. And today in Ukraine, the only canonical church is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That fact is agreed upon by all local Orthodox churches.
We start our Sobor and we give thanks to God. Slava Bogu, we start.
The Council of Clergy and Laity of the three Ukrainian churches culminated the process of granting autocephaly at Kiev's Sophia Cathedral. More than 100 bishops, priests and parishioners gathered for it, with delegates quickly arriving from all over the country.
Unification has now become possible because the Unifying Council was held. The Unifying Council became one of the conditions for obtaining the Tomos. Constantinople simply set a very tough condition and insisted upon it. Either you hold the council, or there will be no Tomos. This forced the state to engage in the process of preparing for the council, and to ensure it took place.
It was not without secular power. The hierarchs could not agree on the conditions of unification, could not decide who would be most important. Only the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate managed to quickly determine this. They made up the smallest group that came to Sophia.
We love our non-canonical brothers. But if we had come to the Sophia Cathedral, well, we would have caused tremendous harm, because we would have indulged those sinful manifestations that forced us to take action and which do not correspond to church tradition, and would have destroyed the church instead of strengthening it.
The Kiev Patriarchate, which became the basis of the new church, was not very interested in involving others in the process of creating this new church. This was, of course, also a traditional Ukrainian scenario, where churches, communities and groups are not ready to work jointly for the common good.
Discussions between the Kiev Patriarchate, its head, and other participants in the unification process touched on everything. The statue of the new church, who will manage it, and how, what kind of ties Kiev and Constantinople will have, and whether the new Ukrainian church itself will be a patriarchate.
Я був патріархом, є і буду.
The common good was obscured by the corporate good of a particular structure. In this case, the Kiev Patriarchate. They still thought of this process as political opportunism, to legalize themselves in order to get the most opportunities in the new structure. It didn't arise from the common good, which is what they may have imagined, but didn't act in the name of.
Another obstacle was Constantinople's reluctance to see Patriarch Philaret as the head of the church. This created tension both between the different churches and within the Kiev Patriarchate itself. In the orderly ranks of the bishops appointed and trained by Philaret, there were competing groups. There were two favourites running in the future synod elections: Philaret's deputy and student Epiphanius, and Metropolitan of Lutsk and Volyn, Mikhail. The conflict escalated. Because of the feud, the council found itself on the verge of collapse. On the day of the council, both the church and authorities brought several thousand people from the regions to Sophia Square. In the cold, listening to music and singing on stage, people waited several hours for the council to begin. Then they waited all day until the fate of the new church was decided in Sophia, and a primate was elected.
This all happened without any prayer. Many pop singers had come out onto the Maidan. Some sang songs, politicians discussed their ideas, they uttered their slogans, they clapped their hands. All of this took place without anything related to the church, even on a subconscious level. Everything was absent. No one even read the Lord's Prayer.
During this time, the real church drama was unfolding in Sophia itself. Metropolitan Mikhail, contrary to the agreement, had refused to withdraw his candidacy in the first round. Because of this, the gathering of the council could have dragged on, or even ended with no outcome. Representatives of Constantinople were ready to leave Kiev.
Митрополит Київський вся України Єпіфаній.
The elections did take place. In spite of the drama and suspense, a new church was founded. The bishops reached an agreement and a primate was elected.
Товарищ Москаль, на Україну шуток не скаль.
Я хотів найперше подякувати всім вам, тут присутнім сьогодні на площі, бо ви стали учасниками цієї історичної події.
During his first address, the new metropolitan was visibly worried. He spent a long time thanking the authorities, his mentor, Patriarch Philaret, and the people in the square. In response, the audience responded with, Slava! Glory. After the speeches, people quickly dispersed, returning to their lives, their cities, villages, and parishes. Ukraine's Ternopil region sits on the border of various ecclesiastical worlds. The jurisdictions are still being clarified here. Novostov village. Here, after the Revolution of Dignity, the parish decided to move to the Kiev Patriarchate. Disputes over the temple started, but eventually they reached an agreement. Now they run the service in turns at the Church of the Archangel Michael.
We've somehow reconciled and now take turns. They go early, we go at 12, they go early, and that's how we made up. We greet each other, talk. Why wouldn't we communicate? What are we going to quarrel about? We don't mind, but we will not be conducting a service with them. What did they do? They climbed through the windows, they did that. We will not conduct the service with them. We will conduct the services separately, and that's all.
Alena has been singing in this temple for a long time, since she first came to the church, and she does not want to change her parish.
I came to church when I was 50 years old. I was still young then. I'm now 80. Old people say that we just want to remain in the same church that we had always attended. We want to die like our parents did.
Orthodox people peacefully coexist here under pressure from the authorities. The parishes were given a choice. The services are either held in turns or they're not held at all.
Well, these calls for Moskals, Russians out. But we come for God. We don't need all this. We don't want politics in our community. We are trying to defend the existence of our community. We are trying to fulfill our needs without outside interference. There cannot be an instant union. They've adopted the law, put a stamp on it, and everyone is delighted, everyone's happy. That's impossible. The same people who cursed each other here, they almost chased each other with axes. Time must pass. First of all, as the Lord said, it is necessary to pray. Remember the basic Our Father. In the end, as the saying goes, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Lately, I've been speaking with churchgoers and non-churchgoers about unification. Sarcasm prevails, the common thought being, the government does everything well, there is no war, the roads are excellent, people have work, only the church has no order.
The church should have been made independent immediately when Ukraine became free in the 1990s. Why twist everything now? Make policy that gets people into a feud. They have no clue what's going on and why.
We will give Tomos and then unite. Again, everything is upside down. We are not leading the horse to the cart. We are pulling the cart to the horse.
We've gotten to the point where people are quarreling among themselves. Let's implement this so that people don't pay attention to prices for gas, for travel, etc. Do you know how much they raised the fare for public transport last week? How much it now costs a pensioner to get to the administrative service center? They are doing this for ratings before the elections. This is a show they themselves don't know, and people are quarreling. Why do people have to quarrel? What are we the Russians? We are not going to that Poroshenko for anything, absolutely not. He gave us nothing. He is strutting around, thinking that if he makes the rounds in Ukraine everywhere, he will be elected again. To hell with these elections. No one will elect him. There is nothing to eat. No one will elect him.
Нам більше нічого. Я губою ти викляпала. То вони будуть співати. Все починаю я. Прийдеться школи брати. Але то таке. Немає нічого і не реклами.
Христа Небесного і відпущення гріхів, у Христа безсмертного Царя Бога нашого, просимо.
The community of the Kiev Patriarchate, now the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, gathered in the Church of Archangel Michael within 10 minutes. They brought the same commemorative bread and held the same memorial service. Everyone had someone to remember on the Day of the Departed. They pray in the same temple, in front of the same icons, but for the time being, they condemn each other behind their backs.
They took our small village of Novostav and divided it into 2 havels. How much longer can we be separated? Let us all come together and attend one single church.
And who divided us? The Moscow Patriarchate? Because everyone signed up for the Ukrainian church, and then the priests of the Moscow Patriarchate arrived and began to cry that our church is already independent.
There is no difference. The main thing is that the people can pray in their own language and understand that they are asking God for what they want.
And it's key that the people don't listen to what Moscow says.
My grandmother once, while she was studying, understood what she read in Old Slavic. And there are even older people. We are not talking about youth. They don't understand.
The sacristan's wife had been attending service here for 30 years, and she doesn't understand.
We stood right here in this courtyard, literally in this place. And the archpriest of the Moscow Patriarchate comes and says, "Who is behind this priest? That's it. If you support the priest of the Moscow Patriarchate, then come here." That's it. Both us and them wanted the creation of the Ukrainian church, and if we are in the Kiev Patriarchate, but they are not, then believe me, it was just the human factor.
The identity of the priest and the position of the church authorities will determine not only what happens in Novostav village, but also in other divided parishes, which will determine with whom to be. In this village, only half an hour between services separates believers. The history of Ukraine's Orthodoxy is not simple. During the last few centuries, it focused on different centres. Hierarchs were appointed in Constantinople, in Rome, in Moscow, served here, in Kiev Sophia Cathedral. For the first time, an independent autocephalous metropolitan took office within these walls. This choice has not been accepted by everyone, but it was confirmed by the ancient and historically dominant Constantinople Patriarchate. Greek priests flew in from Istanbul and Athos. They're freezing, like Byzantine missionaries were freezing 1,000 years ago. A power came that always played its own role in church affairs and set its own goals.
I feel sorry for everyone, and you know, every person of faith deserves respect and love.
If this church is also able to successfully develop away from the state, in a way where it can maintain a partnership with the state, but not be under its heel. The most important matter in Ukraine now is civil society. If the church can understand the principles of this society and establish a partnership with it, this will also be a success.
It is important to always remember that the Church is about the eternal and not about what happens in March or April or some other time of the year.
Those who left the Moscow Patriarchate and came to the new church came here. The rest, those who are thinking about the future jurisdiction, will look at their example.
The question is, how attractive will this picture be? The picture of real life. Everyone will be watching the news on what these new dioceses and clerical corporations are doing. Now everything is in the hands of this new structure.
The head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Major Archbishop Sviatoslav, arrived for the enthronement of the Fraternal Primate. He represents the branch of Kiev Orthodoxy that maintains unity with Rome.
If this church can show openness and does not try to use this historical chance to establish some kind of monopoly on religion in Ukraine, which there is a tendency and predisposition towards, if it can be open and respectful of other religious groups in Ukraine, this will also be a necessary prerequisite for this church to have a healthy existence in Ukraine. I think Ukraine needs moral support now. We will be keeping in touch. I believe that most bishops and priests will come from that church in Ukraine and from us to Ukraine. That there won't be this. It's canonical or non-canonical, or he must have a document to be allowed to conduct a service and so on. These questions will disappear. The church should pursue its own goals first of all. The task of the Ukrainian church, in this sense, is no different to the task of any other church, to create the most space for a person to enter to speak with God. This task's form of localization can be Ukrainian, Romanian, Russian, whichever.
After becoming acquainted with the Byzantine history, and now with our national history, I'm not even saying anything about Rome. I can only be surprised at the exact formula of Boccaccio's The Decameron. These people do everything they can to destroy the church. This is about the cardinal metropolitans. But if the church still exists, then it really is from God. So bear with us, Lord.
Kiev St. Sophia is not just a temple. The church has been an endless source for scholars and researchers. On its ancient walls, historians have found inscriptions left by those who came here. Today, more than 7,000 medieval graffiti writings have been discovered. The oldest appeared shortly after the construction of Sophia. Most of the inscriptions are simple: people's pleas for health, success in business, love, and happiness. But most often, people throughout the ages have asked God for help.
Небесна ясная, Отче всіх світов, священная и непорочная, владычице всех